And now we are getting over to Diet Doctor. And before we kind of get into this, I just have to say, I love Diet Doctor. I love Diet Doctor. This was one of the websites I found very early in my low carbohydrate journey. It is the most wonderful resource for finding recipes, finding meal plans, finding education, the videos, movies that you could buy. You could create your own meal plans. There was a whole back page index that would send you to other websites that were doing awesome work. It was such a cool thing. And I just have to say, like, as the gym that we were working at, they were doing weight loss contests that we had to do every 3 months. It was a 2-month contest we'd have to fill. We'd have to give people the information that the gym would give them about proper nutrition and all the recipes and whole grains and fruits and vegetables and all this other stuff. And when we found low carb, we found a whole different system that we could bypass whatever the gym was doing and just do our own thing. And we started using Diet Doctor meal plans. And all I would do with the cohort of the people that we would have is I would just say, here are these meal plans, find recipes that you love, eat as much of these as you like, and let's see how you do in 60 days. We had much better compliance percentage than the gym's average. The gym average compliance for that contest, somewhere around 15%. Our compliance percentage was up around about 67%. And the numbers that we ended up testing this on a body fat scale for a total of 126 people. The weight that was lost between those 126 people in 60 days was 735 pounds. And the percentage of that weight that came from fat was 720.9 pounds. We were getting people to lose nearly 100% of their weight from fat simply by giving them Diet Doctor meal plans and teaching them in a few seminars, like a few cool things about, low carbohydrate. The people that run Diet Doctor, Andreas Einfeld is the big one. I've met him at Low Carb Denver. He is as kind as he is tall. The dude is very, very tall. One of the kindest humans ever. So this is no knock on them or anything that they're doing. When you found out that they were doing some type of food scoring system, what was your first reaction?
Well, the food scoring system, as far as I understand it, was the brainchild of people outside of Diet Doctor initially. I think it was now I'm trying to get my history right here. I think it was Brian Sanders who originally came up with the satiety per calorie score. And I think Ted had the protein to energy ratio. And somehow this protein to energy ratio got like transmogrified into satiety per calorie. It's sort of the version 2.0 of the protein to energy ratio. And this, I think, really appealed to Andreas Einfeld because he experimented with a higher protein version of low carb and lost, a little bit of extra weight that he has. He's certainly not someone who's overweight, but he probably leaned out just by reducing some of the fat and increasing the protein, which is actually not surprising at all in lean people. I mean, I can see it in myself. If I lower my fat intake, increase my lean protein intake, I'm certainly gonna, lean out. You're gonna see my abs even more. Now, I might not want to do that because I might, not have enough energy to do CrossFit and to work and to be a dad and do all the things I want to do. But it's true. I certainly can lose a bit of body fat doing this. So I'm not surprised at all by that result. But in people who are overweight, it doesn't always work like that. It does for a considerable number of people. In fact, even today, I do tend to recommend people who stall on their fat loss journey. I will tell them that you can certainly experiment dropping the fat and increasing the protein. I don't see a problem with that. I think that's perfectly reasonable. Lots of people have found success with that. That's great. But that's not everyone. And there's a considerable amount of people who have tried this and who have failed. And I think that it's not fair to them to sort of push them out of the conversation, out of the belief that, well, if it hasn't worked, they're probably cheating. They're just eating fat. They don't realize they're just eating too much. And I think when we do that, we're committing the same mistake from the sort of mainstream health advice that low carb was a response to. So that's where my personal disappointment in this approach comes, not because the approach is advocating for more protein, less fat. That's totally fine. That's a great option. Is that this approach excludes the other option, which is some people can overcome their fat loss stall by increasing the relative percentage of fat and doing this at the expense of protein. That is a fact. People have done this. It has worked for them. I know quite a few of them personally. I've seen them in real life. I've spoken with them many, many times. And I've also witnessed it myself with an ex that I had a few years ago. I was sitting next to her 6 months in a row, once when she tried the high protein version first, because that's what I had actually recommended first to her. It didn't work. Then I recommended a higher fat version, still didn't work. Still wasn't losing the fat. So I've seen both modalities fail. And once you've seen the people, eaten the meals with them, they're not cheating. What do you have to, you just have to accept the reality that's in front of you and be like, okay, there's something we don't understand here. It's not simply about restricting fat. We knew very well that fat doesn't simply make you fat. That was, the whole premise of the low carb movement. But I think there's a big contingent in that movement who sort of forgotten this basic message and have sort of, I think, floated back into this comfort zone of saying, well, it does come down to energy balance. You should just eat less fat. You can't just magically have, more energy dense foods and not gain weight. And I think when they say this, they're just forgetting all of the counterexamples. We have lots of people who can, be on a ketogenic diet, which is extremely energy dense by definition, because fat is the principal macronutrient in a ketogenic diet, and they can achieve a lot of success. So if they've achieved success initially and they've stalled, it's not necessarily because they're still eating too much fat. There are a whole host of reasons that could be the case. Some people start taking glucocorticoids, right? And they start storing more fat. Some people get a gut infection. Something changes in their microbiota, their inflammatory profile, and they gain more fat. And they gain more fat on the very same diet in which they were having tons of success beforehand. So I think this is where I take issue with a lot of the arguments made by Ted Naiman and Andreas Einfeld, because I think they're failing to recognize that the experience of these people is equally true as all the other anecdotes that we can point to where people have had success by reducing fat and increasing protein. And I was very, very clear with them on Twitter multiple times when I said, do you even offer a higher fat version as an option? I'm not saying it has to be your first option, not saying it has to be something you emphasize, but is it at least an option? And it is not. They've been very clear with me multiple times. This is not an option for them. This is where they lost me. And this is why I've been so vocal against this concept, because I think it's, although they are marketing it as we're broadening the amount of things people can eat, right? That is the argument of SPC. They say low carb works for some people, but we want to do something a bit different where you can have more dietary choices. It's less restrictive, but you can achieve the same results, maybe even better, right? That is what they've said multiple times. But why? How can that be true if you're removing a very basic option that has basically always been an option in the low carb space? We used to tell people, experiment. Some people would say, no, experiment first with more fat. That's really important because fat is really satiating. Other people would say, no, you have to try high protein first. That's super satiating. You have to do that. And I'm agnostic about which one is going to work best. I don't think we have the trials to demonstrate this. In fact, I know because I've looked and I've checked and I've asked Ted and Andreas to share trials, and they never share trials that are actually designed to answer the question that they are supposedly asking. It's trials that are answering something parallel, something similar, right? And this is where I think we need to sort of come back to basics and realize we don't have those questions yet. We don't know the effects of protein. We cannot extrapolate, the effects of protein on a mixed diet to the ketogenic state, which is very different. And we cannot, conflate someone whose intake from protein, half of it is coming from plants, versus someone's protein intake is coming from animals. It is not the same quality of protein. It is not the same food with which that protein is coming. So we have lots of unanswered questions that are really, really fascinating. And I think we do people a disservice when we pretend we have more answers than we do. And that is essentially the problem I have with the approach. It's the claims don't fit the data that we currently have.
Well, you hear the title, satiety per calorie, and you could think like, okay, that sounds pretty good. Lots of people in the carnivore world talk about how important satiation is, and satiety is super important. It's different than fullness. It's different than a stomach fullness. So the title sounds okay. The per calorie part is where it gets a little bit tricky. Can you tell us how this scale even works and what things they're measuring?
Yeah, so I don't have a direct access to the full algorithm, but they have described it to me in relatively good detail. So it takes into account multiple factors. So the key factor is that, as you said, it's satiety per calorie. So if you imagine a fraction, the top part of the fraction is going to be your satiety, and the bottom part of the fraction is going to be calories. Now, if people don't know, you have carbs, fat, and protein. Carbs and protein have, let's say, 4 kilocalories of energy per gram, and fat has 9. So fat is more energy dense. So right away, if you have something that's per calorie, you're going to be penalizing fat. You're going to be penalizing one of the macronutrients. That's that's what you're doing definitionally. There's no way around that. So you're penalizing fat. So first of all, it's not really an agnostic score as it's being presented because it's penalizing the most energy dense macronutrient. So that's the first thing. Second of all, the factors that go into satiety, what are they? So there's this thing called the hedonic factor. And that is where there's a lot of work being done, quote unquote, by this hedonic factor, meaning they've looked at studies and studies have tried to measure how hedonic a food is. And it's really hard because there's reward, there's palatability, there's the hedonic factor. These are all different words for, how much you like something, basically. I know that there will be more particular definitions to them, but they're not very objective definitions. You can really, it's not like you're defining, I don't know, something like, this is black, this is white. It's not that clear. It's very, very murky. And the way these scores are defined are very circular. You ask people how they rate this food, and they will tell you, this is how I rate this food. Of course, if you ask them 2 weeks after the study's done, they might give you a different score. The studies won't capture that. The studies also won't capture that if they ask you when you come back from a hike and you haven't eaten all day, even the worst tasting food is going to taste pretty good to you if you're hungry, right? So there's these contextual factors, there's these definitional aspects that make the hedonic factor basically a fudge factor. It allows you to mess with the score pretty much as you want. So that's a huge issue when we're trying to quantify something that's really, really hard to quantify. We don't have the means to quantify hedonic factor. These are very low quality studies. These are not high quality studies. This is the first thing to know. The other factor they have is the amount of fiber. The assumption being that the more fiber food has, it lowers the energy density because fiber is indigestible energy for the most part. And it's also known to stretch your stomach, right? That's why people tend to feel bloated or tend to feel very full when they have a salad or fibrous greens, because it activates stretch receptors. And stretch receptors are one of many factors that signal to your brain, hey, food is coming in. We've had some energy. You can eat a bit less now. It's just one factor. It's not an overriding factor. In fact, there was an approach in the 1990s called volumetrics that was popularized by Barbara Rolls. You can type in volumetrics on Google. You'll see there's lots of diet books from the 90s with the big hairdo and stuff. It was very popular back then. It was a total failure. It never worked, meaning, it didn't fix the obesity epidemic. You can't trick your body into eating less simply because you've stretched it out with fiber. It just, our evolution is smarter than that. It's integrating way more signals than this stretch factor. So fiber, unfortunately, is not this trick to get around proper appetite regulation. And then there is the amount of protein in the score, which is an important aspect to satiety. Protein is indeed a, quote, satiating macronutrient, but even this has some limitations. A lot of what they base the fact that protein is satiating on is something called the protein leverage hypothesis, which has been put forth by Simpson and Rabenheimer. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. Two researchers who are actually active on Twitter and engage with people. So if you have questions to ask them, they're pretty cool. You can hit them up. And their protein leverage hypothesis posits that different organisms, not just humans, will keep seeking out food until they've eaten enough protein, basically. That they're guided by protein, and until they hit that protein threshold where they're nourished, they're going to keep searching for energy. So if you eat protein poor foods, you're going to eat more calories because you've got to eat more calories until you reach enough your protein goal, basically. So this hypothesis does hold true, but only within a range of a percentage energy of the diet, meaning that if you're eating a very low percentage of protein in your diet, increasing the protein will bring more satiation. That's absolutely true. But it operates until approximately 15% of calories. So the average American eats about 18% of calories from protein. So right off the bat, we have a huge problem. We're using a hypothesis that only gets up to 15% protein that can explain the phenomena that we're seeing in a variety of organisms, including humans, that you have this protein-seeking behavior in a sense. But it stops being useful to explain observations beyond what the average person is actually eating. And that's not recognized by their score. And we've pointed this out to them multiple times. And basically we get crickets. We don't really get an acknowledgement, oh no, this is not correct because you've misunderstood. Like it's basically not really addressed. So that's another issue. So we have protein, fiber, hedonic factor, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's a combo with salts, maybe. I'm not exactly sure. There's something else in the score. But essentially, they're looking at as many factors as they can that produces satiety, and they're dividing that by a calorie amount. And of course, the goal is to have something that makes you feel full, makes you feel satiated without eating too many calories. Now, there's a big assumption within this whole framework that the goal of the score is to make you eat fewer calories. That's why it's a satiety per calorie score. Now, what is that assumption? That assumption is if I get you to eat less, you will lose fat and you will reverse your obesity. Now, I think we've already tried this. There's probably, maybe 5 decades or more of people saying, okay, how can I eat less? What can I do to eat less? Should I be fasting? Should I be, counting my calories? Should I be eating many small meals? There's whole different strategies to eat less. But what we always keep seeing is that it's not a sustainable strategy. Caloric restriction is a lever for fat loss. I'm not discounting it as a lever. Of course, restricting calories to some extent induces fat loss. It also induces muscle loss. And it is not something that we can do long term. In fact, we know this from the studies done by Ancel Keys so there was this era, I can't remember exactly which year it was, but it was early on in the 20th century. And people who objected to go fight in the war were conscientious objectors. And these people were essentially forced into studies for the army, where they were calorically restricted, and because at the time we didn't know how people reacted exactly. And these people were severely calorically restricted for a lot of time. We're talking about weeks and months. And I think the calorie restriction was pretty severe. I think it was something like 40% of their calories. Don't quote me on that, but it's something substantial. And the descriptions that you can read in those studies are harrowing. I mean, it's people who go crazy, who become violent, who have these very weird behaviors. You'd think they're in a mental institute, when looking at them. And this told us that, restricting calories, like chronic restriction, forced restriction of calories, is not sustainable in any way, shape, or form. And we even see this in the infamous Kettner rice diets that was given to obese people and diabetics, where they were forced to eat like 90% carb diets. And the only way you could get them to adhere to the diet was by harassing them and whipping them. And people will still talk about these diets as evidence of high carb diets being effective for fat loss and diabetes. It's like, I don't think you guys have actually read what they had to do to get these, they're still very interesting results that on such a high carb diets, you can have these weird fat loss and diabetes remission effects, but they're completely unrealistic, unfeasible. And, I think we've learned so much from the dietary history that we're just forgetting when we're inventing these food scores like satiety per calorie. And of course, the assumption, like I was saying, is that, okay, if I get you to eat less, you're going to lose fat. But I don't think that's correct. I think when you lose body fat, you automatically eat less because the fat that you're able to liberate is signaling to your brain, hey, we've got energy. Finally, we can access it. We can remove it from adipose tissue and we can burn it. Now we're actually, quote, full. So yeah, you don't have to eat more now. So there's a fundamental difference in the causality with regards to fat loss between people like me, Gary Taubes, and many others, and people like Andreas, Ted, Kevin Hall, and John Speakman and other researchers. And so there's like you can tell, there's a lot of problems with the satiety per calorie score. And yeah, that's basically the overview.